Welcome everybody to the September Food Systems and Community Development webinar. Today we are lucky to have Todd Ballard here to talk about some of the work he's done around improving water use efficiency in silage production. So as he goes, if you have questions as he's talking, go ahead and type them into the chat. And if they're pertinent in that moment, I'll go ahead and interrupt him and ask him then. Otherwise, we'll get to all the questions at the end of his presentation. So with that, welcome, Todd, and I'll pass you the torch.
All right, thank you. All right. The screen share is working fine?
Yes, I see your screen. We're just not in
Okay.
PowerPoint mode yet. Yep, now we see the PowerPoint.
Okay, so I've been working with a few people in Extension on trying to improve water use efficiency in silage production, with a big focus being on replacing some of the corn acres with sorghum. And this is the same photo that was in the flyer. You can see all the different, you can see several different heights of sorghum here. So to the top left, you see something that would be like a photoperiod sensitive sorghum. That would be something that doesn't flower regardless of how many growing degree days or available heat energy for plant growth occurs until the day length decreases to some length determined by genetics. So typically around 12 hours and 15 minutes. So sometime in early September, it will start to have floral initiation. And with that, you can have a much taller sorghum than any of these others. So to avoid that, you can put some dwarf genes in sorghum, which will make it flower much earlier. One plant to the right there of that would be something that has one dwarf gene activated, and that can be about 7 feet tall and produce quite a bit of grain, which is not reachable with most combine headers. And then in the foreground is hybrid grain sorghum, which is probably the most commonly grown sorghum in the country. And it is much easier to mechanically harvest for grain, not use as much for silage. But it's definitely cheaper to harvest for grain than any of these others. So what is silage? So silage is forages which have been fermented by lactobacillus and a few other bacteria to create an acidic environment, which then prohibits growth of pathogenic bacteria and fungus. So in that acidic environment, you can store it for very long at a high moisture content, and then that you don't have to go through all the process that you would to dry out hay. So how is it used? It's used mainly as a feedstuff for dairy cattle. It is used in quite a few other applications for animals, though. Beef cattle, sheep, lamb, goat, camels mentioned as an example in here. And then I'll go over perspective of how much water is currently used for our state's silage compared to the total water use of the state and the total water use for agriculture in the state. And it is a significant amount of water. And then my ideas for improvement of water use efficiency and the current research which is going on in Extension for this project. So silage is forage that has undergone fermentation using lactobacillus. The fermentation creates an acidic environment which prevents pathogens from growing in the forage. So you're not going to have any molds growing in it if it's properly fermented. Not going to have any sort of E. coli growing in it if it's properly fermented. All those things are going to be prevented by the lactic acid which is present. So the advantages of silage over hay eliminates the need for multiple passes to harvest hay. So typically when you harvest hay, you'll cut it with a swather, and then with that swathed row of grass or legume sits out in the sun, the top will dry before the bottom, so you have to go back and turn it over with a rake. Then the bottom will dry, and then you can come back and bale it after that. So you're looking at multiple passes to get the forage out of the field. Assuming it doesn't rain, in which case you would need to turn it yet again. So that's quite a bit of equipment time and cost occurred with that process. So silage will include water intake when feeding. So that that will keep your animals better hydrated than if they were to eat a dry hay, and they can consume it faster rather than stopping eating the dry hay and go over for a drink immediately and come back. Things like that. And then it prevents the mold, which can happen in hay drying or storage. So the disadvantages. So when you harvest a forage for silage, it's about 70% water. When you produce something, which is when you're transporting something that's 70% water, you're paying logistics costs for something that for the water, which really has no nutritional value in itself. So typically a silage will be harvested within 50 miles of where its final use will occur. So you can see hay that's transported across the country. I've seen it harvested in Indiana and hauled to Florida. Texas has a very dry year. You can see it harvested in Nebraska, carried down to Texas, other way around. If Nebraska has a poor year, it'll be hauled up from Texas to Nebraska. So that's not economically feasible with silage just because of all the water mass. So you must inoculate it in a timely manner. You bring that wet forage in. You don't go ahead and put the lactobacillus on it. And shortly after that, put it in an anaerobic condition. You'll go ahead and you will have those pathogens and molds grow on your forage, and then it's wasted. And it requires maintaining an anaerobic fermentation. So this used to be done in the tall cylindrical silos, and but those are no longer used on a large scale. There's probably some people that still use them, but for the most part, that's done with a pit that is then covered up with a plastic tarp, and that plastic tarp will limit the oxygen coming into the ensiling process. So uses of silage in Colorado, by far the largest is dairy cattle. Anywhere between 30 and 60% of dairy cattle feed can be silage. Beef cattle feedlots will use it some, not nearly to the concentration as dairies, but it is used. And then sheep that are raised for meat, goat that are raised for meat, and then there's some other small uses. Alpaca, I know there's a few alpaca farms in the area of Northeast Colorado. They're used for their high quality wool. Llama, same idea. Camels, there is a camel dairy in Northeast Colorado. That milk is sold primarily in Fort Morgan, where there's a large population of people who consume camel milk, and the dairy goat as well. So where does Colorado use its water? So Colorado Water Knowledge Center at CSU provided this graph. And so there's a total of about 4.7 million acre feet used in a year. Used in agriculture in a year, and that really dwarfs any other use. So municipal and industrial water use is less than 10% of that, and self-supplied industrial water use is even less than that. So corn silage produced in Colorado, 230,000 acres are produced according to the National Ag Statistics Service. I discussed the use of water for corn silage production with our water resources extension specialist out in Akron, Joel Sneeklaw. And we decided to use a number of 23 inches of evapotranspiration in a fully irrigated field for this example. And that's a reasonable number for Weld County, where our highest concentration of dairy cattle is in the state. If you go somewhere into the southern Colorado at lower elevations, someplace like Prowers County or Baca County, or even a little bit west of there, if you were to go into Rocky Ford, it would be more. If you're at a higher elevation, it would be less, just because of the water, or just because of the temperature. Lower temperature will have less evapotranspiration. Again, using the NAS data, there's 5.3 million tons produced, and that's assuming 70%. That is the fresh weight. So the goal is to harvest at 70% moisture. NAS unfortunately does not include the moisture question as part of their survey. So I went with you could go with an assumption of about 70%, but that's certainly not right on target. There's sometimes when you're going to be getting the field a little late, it'll be drier, a little earlier, it'll be wetter. So that comes up with a total of 18 billion gallons of water, which is used for corn silage production in Colorado, which is 441,000 acre feet. And if you go back to the previous slide, you'll see that that's more than municipal and industrial use, and it's about 9% of total agricultural water use in the state. So it's a whole lot of water goes into silage production in the state. So the question I'm out to answer with my research is, can sorghum reduce this demand? So what is sorghum? Sorghum is a genus of C4 grasses. So C4 is a photosynthesis method which is used primarily by tropical grasses. It is more efficient for plant growth in tropical environments and in our summers than a C3 grass. Most plants use C3 photosynthesis, but in a cold environment, it's not going to work very well. So just like we can grow wheat in the wintertime, there's no way we could grow sorghum in the wintertime, and part of that reason is its photosynthesis pathway. So so there's some well-known members of the sorghum genus. Johnson grass is a major weed really across the continental U.S. Was brought in from Jamaica in the NRCS as a soil conservation method, and has spread as a noxious weed in many places. Columbus grass is more of a problem in subtropical areas. So if you go into Florida and to southern Texas, you'll see Columbus grass as a weed. It looks a lot like sugarcane, but it does have a different inflorescence than sugarcane would, and a much skinnier stalk. Sudan grass is used as a forage in the U.S., more commonly as a hybrid with sorghum bicolor. And sorghum bicolor is a species of all of these sorghums that are on the right side picture. So hybrid grain sorghum is the one that's of greatest economic importance. A lot of people refer to that as Milo, including the Chicago Board of Trade. Biologically, it's not Milo. Its mother is. Its dad would be Kefir, different land race of sorghum. Broom corn is actually not corn, it's sorghum. And hybrid forage sorghum is what I hope to focus on our talk on today. So forage sorghum types, dual purpose will be the one I mentioned with the single dwarf gene activated. Will be up to 7 feet tall and produce a lot of grain, which is not reachable with a combine head and without extensive modification to your combine. So it's expensive to harvest for grain because you would have to custom design your harvest header just for a single application. Can have a high relative feed value with good harvest timing. Now I put with good harvest timing on there because if you wait too long, you come up with a very high starch content, and the starch content is not good for feed quality. Sorghum Sudan grass offers multiple harvests per year. So on a lot of these forage sorghums, you're only going to want to harvest it once at the end of the season, which is good if you're looking to minimize your harvesting cost. It's bad if you need to feed your cattle today. So with the sorghum Sudan grass, if you don't have storage available, if you're short on hay from last year, you can grow that and it'll be ready 2 or 3 times during the summer rather than a single time late in the summer. But it does have lower relative feed value than most forage sorghum. That's because of a high lignin content. The photoperiod sensitive, that was the tallest one I showed. We'll have floral initiation early in September, and will continue to grow until frost. So with this type, you're not going to have mature grain anywhere north of about 30 degrees north. So maybe even further south than that. So you don't run into the same issue you would with the dual purpose of having a very starchy forage due to being beyond the maturity level that you'd like. So that is an advantage of the photoperiod sensitive. It's going to have a lot more lodging potential. That's a drawback. So if it gets tall and you have a late August, early September windstorm knocks it down, it's going to be more difficult to harvest that material. Sweet sorghum is used for cottage industry molasses. So if you go to like an agritourism dairy, I've seen several of those around Kentucky and Tennessee, where a small dairy will make their own ice cream and have people come into their shop. So they will sell some of the molasses that they grow the sorghum on the land there. So that is just a high sugar content juice. There are different hybrids of that if you want something that would be high glucose or high sucrose. So the high glucose one was really bred for ethanol and for molasses. The high glucose was bred as an attempt to, the high sucrose was bred as an attempt to extend the harvesting season for sugarcane folks and to produce sucrose in areas which are between this subtropical areas where sugarcane can be grown and the temperate, truly temperate areas, or where we are, that would have a potential to grow. Well, actually, we do grow quite a bit of sugar beet. So if you're looking for some latitude between there to grow crystallized sugar, you would try to do that. But I don't think anyone's ever succeeded with that economically on a large scale. So sorghum's reputations. Sorghum requires less water to produce biomass than corn, so that's a good thing. And so, citing these 3 articles here at the bottom, one quote would be: forage sorghum yields have been similar to that achieved with corn, and in most years required at least 40% less irrigation water than fully irrigated corn. That came from this Texas A&M article listed on the bottom. And just kind of discussing between what is the potential for total water savings rather than just the 40% on irrigated only. In Colorado, I saw an article from Kansas State Extension that showed 33% less. Wilma Trujillo and I talked about that and kind of set a goal of a little bit less than that, of trying to save 25% of the water use in corn silage. But that's still quite a bit of water to decrease the water use for corn silage by 25%. So the bad, many producers view sorghum as having a lower nutritional value than corn. This was true for many years, but there's 2 traits which have been added to a lot of the forage sorghum hybrids in the last 10 to 15 years that have changed that. And so really a big part of my project is to show enough data that producers are convinced that they can now use the forage sorghum and have just as good a milk production as they do with corn. So from the Dairy Science Journal here, milk yield and percentage fat and protein were lower for cows fed the normal forage sorghum diet compared with the other forages. No differences were observed in milk yield or component composition of cows fed the brown midrib forage sorghum compared with corn silage or alfalfa silage. And we'll talk a little bit more about what brown midrib is here in a second. And so the ugly. Cattle fed sorghum silage are more likely to experience Durin toxicity than cattle fed corn silage. And Durin is also known as glycoside. It is a form of cyanide. So if you have sorghum that's extremely drought stressed or has experienced the frost before you harvest it, you have the potential to create that form of cyanide, and you don't want to feed your cattle cyanide. That would be dangerous. But seed companies are now using a trait developed at Purdue to eliminate the Durin production. So that risk is going away fast. We're probably about 2 years away, maybe even 1, from having commercially available hybrids which cannot produce that toxin. And if you want to look at an article discussing that, here on the bottom is a master's thesis written at Purdue from the geneticist who found that gene. That gene's now been purchased by a seed company to add to their hybrids, and so we'll eliminate that source of cyanide in sorghum. So what is brown midrib? Well, 2 things have been added to these forage sorghum hybrids in about the last 15 years or so to improve their nutritional quality. One of them is brown midrib. So plants have 3 structural carbohydrates, basically, the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And the more lignin you have, the lower the nutritional value, because it is dietary fiber. You can't gain weight or produce milk if you're just taking in dietary fiber. So brown midrib is a trait which makes the plant produce less lignin, so it makes it more nutritional to get rid of that excess dietary fiber. And brachytic is a trait which will make the distance between leaves shorter, and so the more leaf mass to stalk mass you have, again, the better the nutritional value. So those two traits have been added to a lot of the modern forage sorghums to improve their nutritional value. And so with that, we've achieved something which is similar, in some cases even better than corn. So history of quality concerns with sorghum silage. So for many years, it did have a lower total digestibility than corn. Brown midrib was actually discovered prior to the cellulosic ethanol movement, but really didn't get a lot of attention. And people who wanted to produce cellulosic ethanol wanted something that had a low cost for breaking down the lignin to access the cellulose that you were going to make ethanol from. And so to do that, you would use an acid or a base, depending on which researcher you talk to break down the lignin and access that cellulose. But the breeders said, hey, we have this material which genetically produces less lignin. Can you use that? And so there was a lot of games played. A lot of research done. Is the best way to reduce the time exposed to acid, or is it just to reduce the total amount of acid that's used to make it more economical to access the cellulose? And so they said, hey, we'll go ahead and look at those. And with that interest, the breeders started taking those brown midrib trait forage hybrids and forage varieties and making them produce more biomass, because the original ones produced less than half the biomass of what the high producing biomass producing forage sorghums at the time did. And now they're really competitive. So after it's been 11 years, I think, since the start of the cellulosic ethanol interest. And so during that time, the breeders have been able to make brown midrib forage sorghum, which is competitive on a biomass basis with forage sorghum that doesn't have that. So, so then we lost this. Oil was $200 a barrel in 2011, 2012, and so that price went down. People lost interest in cellulosic ethanol, and the breeder said, "Hey, we developed these hybrids which have low lignin content. Let's use them more as a forage than as an ethanol source." And so many producers still believe that the forage sorghum has a lower feed quality than corn silage. And so that's really what I'm hope to research more in depth to show that that's not the case if you use the proper hybrids. So what has CSU done along these lines? So recent efforts to promote alternatives to silage corn in Colorado, 2016 and 2015 in Rocky Ford and Walsh. Kevin Larson, Brett Pettinger, and Wilma Trujillo. Wilma Trujillo is still involved in this project. The other two researchers I'm not familiar with. So the scope of testing at Rocky Ford. So there was 29 hybrids tested from 5 seed companies, and they were all forage sorghum. And so, as you can see, there's a big range on the potential of biomass production. And this is under irrigation. So the best producing biomass-wise hybrid produced 50 tons per acre, fresh weight, and the worst produced 12.7 tons per acre. So there's a huge difference. So it demonstrates if you want to produce biomass, you got to choose the right hybrid. So at Walsh, they were more interested in the quality than just the volume. And here we see a big range again on how much protein was produced. So pearl millet, which is not a sorghum, but it's a same genus as the proso millet we grow out here for grain. It had a crude protein content close to 20%. The worst protein producer was something that was a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, less than 8% protein. And our corn, which is our check, was only 14.5, was below the worst. Below the worst below the worst non-corn competitor, and better than the worst non-corn competitor. So a big weakness of this test, which I'll openly admit here, is there was only one corn hybrid included in the test. So To give corn a fair shot, we need to give a variety of corn, include a selection of corn hybrids in the test, not just a single representative. And then again, same theme, we're looking more at quality at this location. The in vitro total dry matter digestibility. The best one was a sorghum. The worst one was a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid. And corn once again lies in the middle. So Walsh without irrigation. This RFQ here is relative feed quality. It is pretty closely related to relative feed value, but it's a more modern measurement. So here, actually our worst non-corn entry had a higher relative feed quality than our only corn entry. And sorghum was our best sorghum was outstanding in this location. So the biomass there at Walsh. So here again, we have a lot of different entries. 8 different seed companies. There was 10 forage sorghum, 10 were sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, and we had 2 pearl millet. And with dry land, we have much less biomass potential than with our irrigated site. And the irrigated site, our highest biomass was 50 tons per acre. Here we're at 15.7. With the forage sorghum and the pearl millet was about a third of that. So I've harvested 1 location this year for my test, and our best producing forage sorghum there was about 12 tons per acre. I didn't go back and look at the 2015 and 2016 weather in Walsh, but I can tell you when we planted in Bethune this year, where my best producing hybrid was 12 tons. It was extremely dry in second half of June and all of July. So I think that 12 tons per acre would be better than really any other forage I saw in the area. So other forages to contribute to a reduction in corn silage acres. So sorghum is not the only answer. I have seen a increase in demand for triticale. So it's harvested as a hay, a lot in Logan County, some in Morgan County, and then hauled as dry hay up to Weld County, where the majority of the dairy operations are occurring. Forage wheat. So triticale is a hybrid between wheat and rye. Forage wheat would be any wheat that does not have awns on it. So around its seed head, there's none of the little awns or the little needles that will come out of the seed head, and so you don't get scratches all over your cattle's face whenever they're trying to eat it. Cowpea is something I have a specialty crop grant accepted to try to produce some. And German millet. So German millet is a millet which is that is focused entirely on forage production rather than like a pearl millet, which can be used as either a grain millet or a forage millet, depending on markets. So beyond what plant we choose, how else can we save water? So the types of irrigation that are used in all these. So flood irrigation has the lowest capital cost. It's also extremely inefficient because unless you level the land that you're flooding like you would a rice paddy, you're going to have to keep the low spots under too much water by the time you get water to reach your high spots. So that makes it quite inefficient. Overhead sprinkler is the most common in Colorado. So that would be your center pivots or your linear pool. Center pivot, you just have the spot where the well is in the center of your irrigation system, and then everything will pivot around that, so you don't have to have any moving lines around your your well. Seepage, I don't know that I've seen seepage used in Colorado, but it is worth mentioning here for nationwide production. It's used in soils with high hydraulic conductivity. So if you're using something if you're in a soil which is almost all sand, like you would see some in Louisiana, or something that is a peat-based soil, like you will see in parts of Louisiana and more commonly in Florida, you can use seepage, and with that, you'll just have frequent ditches cut through your field. you'll fill up those ditches with water, and then the hydraulic conductivity will allow the water to move towards between the middle of those ditches, and fill up your fields that way. We have, let's say most of our soils, if not all of our soils in the agricultural part of the state, have too much clay and silt in it to really do that in a timely manner. And then subsurface drip. It is by far the most efficient. So on all these others, you have potential for evaporation before it reaches your plant. With the overhead sprinkler, you have the potential of it being carried away by the wind before it even touches the water being carried off by the wind before it even touches the ground. Subsurface drip, you don't have either of those potentials because you're putting the water directly in the root zone. And so it has to pass through the soil profile before it has the potential to evaporate. And your soil surface will remain fairly dry when using the subsurface drip. And you'll just put the water right there next to the roots where you want it. The drawback of this is the high capital cost to install. So that's something I think I'd like to work with a economist to answer a few questions on that. So I've heard this feedback from producers and some from researchers for a long time that this high capital cost to install is a deterrent of using subsurface drip, even on a 10-year cost basis. But I tried it some in Florida on sugarcane. Really seemed to be an enormous money pit. And our regional ag business management specialist here in Northeast Colorado, Brent Young, has used it on his own farm and been quite satisfied with the ROI. So I think it would be interesting to see on a silage production basis what you can get on a 10-year return on a subsurface drip system compared to an overhead sprinkler system, especially with the increased cost in people making those overhead center pivots more expensive. So what do all these systems look like? So flood irrigation, you'll run some sort of pipe around your field. Frequently PVC, this pipe here is not PVC, but you'll just poke some holes in it and flood your field with it. Pretty simple. Overhead sprinkler, so you'll have a well down here at the top left of the screen, and a big either diesel or electric motor will turn that thing as you pump water around your field. The biggest challenge with this really is to keep a consistent application, to make sure you always have the right nozzles in place. The most common issue I've seen with this really is people grab whatever nozzle they happen to have in their truck whenever they see a damaged nozzle and put it on there, and then you have one stripe across your field, which is either wetter or drier than the rest of your field when you didn't want it to be. And so you're wasting production potential by not using the right parts. Seepage irrigation. This is probably the least used in Colorado. If it's used, it would be in the potato production or onion production would be my guess. And subsurface drip. So you have this hose here, which looks a lot like a soaker hose you could use on your yard. And over, so here, just kind of directly underneath the eye, you'll see a little hole poked in this rubber tape, and that will be where the water comes out. So you'll need to bury this, and some of that expense and on the capital really is the installation cost is quite a bit. You'll have to put one of these tapes down every line. So if you're on a 30-inch row, it'll be about every 30 inches you put one of these tapes all the way across your field. So quite a bit of tape is required to use this irrigation system. So measuring evapotranspiration, how do we know how much water we are using in the field? So some of the inefficiency of any crop, really, don't want to pick on corn too much, is just going out there and irrigating whenever water is available. So just because you have access to a well doesn't mean you should be using it every day or using it to its full potential every day. So you can measure how much water is left in a field several ways. There's at least 6 different models that are used to predict how much evapotranspiration occurs in any day. The most well-known of those models from a soil physics perspective is called Penman-Monteith, and that's the math of it up here in the top right corner. But that model is not the most accurate in Colorado, I'd say. A lysimeter. So a lysimeter, this is a system where you will weigh everything that comes in and out of your soil. So you have a scale dug down underneath your soil pit, placed underneath your soil pit, and then everything that's enclosed. So basically the only thing that comes in and out of that is what you put in it, including the rainwater that you allow to fall in it. So you're weighing the water that comes in, you're weighing the water that comes out. Pretty simple concept, very expensive to install. I've never seen it really used on a commercial basis. It's used purely for research. Imagery, so a couple different indices can be used on imagery. The normalized difference water index is one of them. And also leaf temperature is another. So problem with that is you usually find out that you didn't irrigate enough too late. There's already been plant damage occur by the time you can see anything in the picture. And then the last option is soil moisture sensors. See, there's portable ones. There's one that you can install in your field and come back at the end of the season and pull them out. From a labor perspective, it would be nice to have some that are you can place in the field and their cost is not high enough that it would justify to go and retrieve them. And really, Raj Khosla, who's with CSU for quite a while now at Kansas State, has made some big advances on making that possible. So that way we can know how much water in a very specific part of the field is needed, and you can have a computer adjust your water pressures on your overhead as it goes around. So what is the next step? So the current testing, we have 9 forage sorghum hybrids, 3 hybrids each from Sorghum Partners, Alta, and Advanta. We've planted those in 4 dryland locations and 2 irrigated locations. 2 irrigated locations are further south, Lamar, which is over here on Highway 50, and Ordway, which is just north of Rocky Ford. The 4 dryland, Paxton is in the area that I service in extension. So far northeastern Colorado, that's Phillips County, close to Holyoke. 2 between Sterling and Akron that are in Logan County. That's why I listed as Sterling instead of Akron. And then Bethune, which is in the Burlington area. So the people involved in this testing are Wilma Trujillo, who provided all of the funding for the current testing with her crops clinic money, and also has contacted several producers so that we can have access to the land. Ron Meyer, who's the agronomist over in Burlington, the 6 producers, which allowed us on the land, and me. So the goals, I want to expand testing into a multi-state with best performing hybrids and the current test plus new ones. So far, I have 1 professor at Kansas State who's interested in doing that, who's also an agronomist. That brings me to kind of the next spot here, the feeding trial. So I really need someone in animal science to be interested in writing a grant proposal for this with me. So the feeding trial with the high SRFB sorghum blended at several concentrations into feed rations. So can we replace 10% of corn, 20% of corn? If we replace 20% of corn and it goes down, can we add some, the milk production goes down, can we add some grain and get that back, things like that. Water timing and volume. So the demand for water for any crop really is not a continuous, is not a constant throughout the season. So, you'll need more water right before floral immersion. You'll need a lot of water at the beginning of your peak of vegetative growth rate. So don't need to put the same amount of water on every day. You put water on according to what the plant needs, not just whatever is available again. So I'll present this year's results at the Eastern Colorado Crops Clinic, and that will expose the research to lots of crop consultants. And so I want to increase the forage sorghum proportions in feed rations. Hopefully, just kind of rough ballpark, I have a goal of 20% there in dairy rations. Sorry, 20% of the corn volume that's currently in dairy rations. And reduce the water consumption per ton of final animal product. So I can measure from an agronomic perspective, I can measure how much biomass I'm producing, what the relative feed quality is of that. But in the end, we want to make sure that we are producing how much water. We want to reduce how much water it takes to produce a pound of beef, how much it takes to produce a pound of lamb, how much it takes to produce a gallon of milk. All those things are of interest. So again, I'll need to have an animal scientist jump on board for that part of the project. So thank you. There's several people that helped me get this done. Seminar organizers. Forage Professor Joe Brummer has allowed me to use his silage chopper to harvest these 6 locations. Interns for Jen Busolo came out and did stand counts with me. Animal science extension agents have provided me with some information on the volume of silage that's in different feed rations, and all the farmers that have allowed us onto their land. So with that, this Jersey bull would like to accept questions.
Thanks so much, Todd. And to the participants, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're uncomfortable, you can type them in the chat, whichever you prefer, if you have some questions. While we're waiting on that, you were saying connections. Jasmine Dillon, did you see her? She's a professor in animal science. Did you see her food systems webinar? It was a while ago. It's one of the first ones on the website, but she might be a good one for you to reach out to in partnership, because she's looking at sustainability and the life cycle of meat production. So she might be a good one to look up.
Okay. Write down her name here.
And she does have a webinar if you kind of want to look at it and see what she's done.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions for Todd? Well, for everybody here, our next webinar is October 13th, and that webinar should be really interesting. We are putting together some of the interns. So Todd had 2 interns. We had about 60 interns throughout the state. Oh, good. There's a question. We'll go to that first. How much silage sorghum is currently produced in the state?
So I did not pull that up on the NAS records. I have noticed a lot more forage sorghum planted this year than in years past. So I'd say it's probably increasing at a 50% rate greater than last year, but I don't know if it's any sort of long-term projections on that yet.
Any other questions? I don't want to cut you off with my announcement about our next webinar if there's more questions.
So the National Agricultural Statistics Service has that broke down by state and by county. Sometimes it's hard to find details for smaller crops, just because if there's less than, if it's less than 4 producers in a given area, that will not be published for public consumption, just for privacy concerns.
All right, and I don't know if Todd, if you want to put your email address in the chat in case people have questions following this presentation.
Sure.
And so our next webinar is October 13th, and this one we had 60 interns across the state this summer, and we're going to hand select 5 or so of them, and we're going to have an intern session where about 5 minutes each intern with questions. So it's going to be a lightning session, our next webinar. So that's October 13th. So thank you everybody for joining us.